Hey everybody, Andy Kvernen with another Cornerstone Connection Daily Devotional. Have you ever been out serving the Lord and you just felt like, man, things are going amazing and God is working, and all of a sudden you just kind of took one in the face? I think that happens to us from time to time. You know, we're serving God and God's blessing us, our ministry. Maybe it's relationships in our neighborhood. Maybe it's with our family. We've been praying for our kids and we just are seeing breakthrough after breakthrough, and it's awesome. And then all of a sudden something bad happens and we just wonder, God, what are you doing? I think that happens for believers in a variety of contexts, and certainly it happened in the first century as the gospel went out from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And here we had a man named the Apostle Paul, who had been met by Jesus on the road to Damascus and called to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. And so here in Acts chapter 19, we find Paul in a place called Ephesus, where there's a ton of pagan influence. Ephesus is this great city. It's this marvelous place where there's all kinds of opulence. The buildings are huge. There are mansions there. I was actually in Ephesus a few weeks ago. And friends, there's a mansion there that was 6,000 square feet, a first century, or maybe it was second century mansion. But these people had money, they had power, they had prestige, and they were also rooted in a lot of really dark things. And so Paul shows up there and he goes to the synagogues where there's some God-fearing people and some Jews, and he starts to reason with them. And he faces adversity there, and they kick him out. And so then he goes into a place called the Hall of Tyrannus. Tyrannus was likely this academic there that would teach his pupils in the morning and would rent out his building to Paul in the afternoons. And it's kind of the time when everybody else would be taking a nap, a siesta, but Paul thought, well, if I can get that, I can get it. And so he starts teaching, and sure enough, people start showing up. And God starts doing some amazing things. And some of these strongholds in Ephesus start breaking down, and some people start coming to know and trust Jesus. Now, one of the things you need to know about Ephesus is it's a place where they worship the goddess Artemis. And Artemis was a fertility goddess. She had control of the animal kingdom. And so she was this really ugly goddess who was very sexualized in their context, and the people worshipped her. And in fact, there was a whole temple dedicated to her. It was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. It was a temple about a football and a field and a half long and about as wide as a football field, if I remember right. It was a massive place, and the people were supremely proud of Artemis, their goddess, in this place. Well, Paul starts showing up, and you know what happens? More and more people start turning to Jesus and turning away from Artemis. And you know what happens then? Those people that are profiting from the worship of the goddess Artemis, they're shrine makers, they're artists who are making shrines so that people can worship her, not just at the temple, but in their homes. They start losing money, and they start being threatened by the ministry that Paul and his compatriots are presenting to the Ephesian people. And they start to push back. And all of a sudden, we come to the latter part of Acts 19, and there's this guy Demetrius who sort of raises up a whole bunch of people and says, hey, if we don't start pushing back against these people, our whole way of living is going to be shot down. And the next thing you know, there's this great uproar. I saw this in vivid form because I saw the theater where it happened. And so you get to verse 28 of Exodus 19. It says, when they heard that Paul was taking away their business and diminishing the role of Artemis, they were furious, and they began shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And soon the whole city was in an uproar, and the people seized Gaius and Aristarchus. These are Paul's buddies, and Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. And so here all these people, they're mad as can be. Paul and his buddies are threatening their way of life, and it's a theater of about 25,000 people. They're packed in there, and they start going crazy. Here's what it says. It says, Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples wouldn't let him, and even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. This is a tense situation. It says the assembly was in confusion, and some were shouting one thing and some another, and most of the people didn't even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him, and he motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours. And here's what they said. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Can you imagine? People in such an uproar, so offended by the gospel, that they shout for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis, great is our goddess," in the face of the true God, the one true God, the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit. They're crying out for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." It was a tense situation. Paul wanted to rush in there. He wanted to reason with them. He loved these people. He'd been sharing the gospel with these people. But friends, it was time. And so as we continue to read in Acts 19, Paul's buddies keep him from compromising his life in that moment. There was still more for God to do. And Paul ended up having to leave Ephesus. But you know what happened during his time there? The seeds of the gospel were planted, and a church was sprung up from Ephesus. And you know who came there later? The Apostle John. John came there later, and John had a ministry, I'm convinced, with the Ephesian church. And he even wrote his gospel, I believe, while he was in Ephesus in order to continue to help those people grow. You know what happened to Paul? He had to leave Ephesus. I think he came back there another time later, but not in the same way. He never for 2 years like he was this time. He had to leave, but you know what he did? He went and he shared the gospel with other people. Friends, sometimes we get stuck on this idea that God has to bless what we're doing now, here and forevermore. And we love what we do, and we get involved with what we do. Maybe it's a person that we've been discipling. Maybe it's a group of neighbors. But God closes the door on that. Friends, when God closes a door, I'm convinced he always opens another one. And he has a purpose in that. Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, he had the office of apostle, capital A, but he had an apostolic bent. Paul was a sent one, and he knew, hey, if God closes a door here, I'm going to go there. Friends, where's God closed a door for you lately? And how are you trying to beat on that door when actually it's closed? And where could you go instead to follow him, to share the gospel? Maybe it's to another neighbor. Maybe God would call you to start praying for specifically somebody else in your neighborhood. Maybe it's a different coworker. Maybe God's calling you to develop a relationship there. Maybe it's a growth group. Maybe you've been a part of the same growth group for a long time, but the Lord would have maybe some other people for you to reach, and your growth group would split. And here you're raising up another leader, and at the same time you're making your group available for more people to be influenced by the gospel. Where's that apostolic bent coming for you? What's God stirring in you? Sometimes people rise up and say, hey, we're not into this. That happens. That's happened for missionaries all around the world. That happened certainly for Paul here in this moment. But remember, when God closes a door, he opens another one. Where's he leading you? Let's trust God together these days. God bless you, friends. Have a great day. And Lord willing, we'll see you again soon on the Cornerstone Connection.